Thank you. In fact, in many ways, it feels iniquitous to introduce Adam, as many people know his highlights already, but I should just highlight a few. I've already mentioned he's an assistant professor at Southern Methodist University. He received his PhD from Harvard only in 2016. He's had numerous fellowships beside the Zurbarán Centre and a number of publications, a number of which I should highlight here. In fact, there is one article that's forthcoming this very month, November 2021, in Art History, Velasquez and the Fragile Painting of the King. His book, which he says I should highlight, was completed during his Zurbarán Fellowship. Identity Inquisition and Inquisition in the Early Modern Hispanic World is forthcoming with Penn State University Press next year. And another article I asked me to highlight was in the Art Bulletin in March 2020. I think that is suffice it to say about Adam, and I think I should now hand over to Adam, who will speak to us for about 45 minutes, and then we shall proceed to questions. Adam, over to you.
Thanks so much, Piers. I'm just going to share my screen, and it's so nice to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Thanks for joining today. Does that look all right? Could someone confirm that that looks okay?
Yes, it does. Before I mute myself, yes, it does.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to start. Thank you so much, Piers. Thank you, Claudia, both for the invitation. And thank you also to all of you for being here. This is a new project, and I'm looking forward to having your feedback on it, to seeing what ways it could go, its viability. It's so nice to be back in Durham, at least digitally for now. And I know that the supporting institutions are the Embassy of Spain and the Instituto Cervantes. And I want to highlight that because I myself studied at the Instituto Cervantes in Krakow many years ago. And so I'm especially delighted to continue that relationship. I'm sorry also to not have attended the talks thus far on Wednesdays, but I know that some of my students are joining today and they know that Wednesday is a busy teaching day. I am going to begin my talk today with a passage from a homily by a Aragonese Dominican named Jerónimo Bautista de Lanuza, written in the first quarter of the 17th century. It's well known that the most perfect creation to have emerged from God's hands among those that are visible is the light. And God himself wanted to confirm that it had no fault. And he looked at it in its entirety and he saw that it was good. He made it and he began to look at it as if examining it whether it had any flaws. Speaking in our way, hablando a nuestro modo, it was like the painter who paints the face in an image, and having worked on it with his brush, he distances himself from it to examine it and to survey how it came out. And he says, it is good. It is from this excerpt that I borrowed the title of my talk today. Lanuza pivots from the divine to the human realms with the phrase, hablando a nuestro modo, speaking in our way or speaking in our manner. That is to say, in a manner easily understood, we infer by his 17th century Spanish listeners. Then he deploys not just any type of comparison, but specifically an artistic one of the judicious painter who considers, examines, and eventually approves of his or her labor. This passage can stand in for a widespread, but still, I think, poorly examined phenomenon in literary production from across the early modern Hispanic world, especially between the 16th and the 18th centuries. That is, the authors of texts from a wide range of subjects, especially in religious doctrine broadly understood and in political theory, turn to art, to its making and its experiencing in order to explain complex tenets in those fields. I first noticed the numerous occurrences of artistic practices being used as didactic metaphors when working on my first forthcoming book that Piers mentioned. In that project, I relied heavily on online databases such as Google Books, the Internet Archive, and HathiTrust to identify period sources that spoke to my particular interests, namely the overlappings between religious imagery and ostensibly secular portraiture. And I'll briefly just show you some of those image types to show you the kind of works that anchored my research. These included what we can call sanctified portraits, or images of non-holy individuals purposefully depicted as saints, so-called true portraits of modern saints, including Ignatius of Loyola and Teresa of Avila, repainted portraits, that is to say, secular images that were transformed into images for devotion through the addition of text or religious attributes, or vice versa. And finally, royal portraits, which in functional terms possess certain crucial similarities to sacred imagery, and donor portraits, in which living individuals intruded into historically distant religious episodes. I should note here, by way of digression, that you undoubtedly noticed that I illustrated the passage from Lanuza with Eduardo Zamacois's historicizing 19th century representation of a painter at work. And I hope you forgive me that I'm not really going to dissect poor Zamacois's work here. But the text-heavy nature of my current research means that images most frequently come in as comparanda that enhance the texts I'm discussing, but only infrequently relate to them directly. Even less common is it for the texts themselves to be illustrated, perhaps with the exception of an occasional decorative frontispiece. This is not to say that early modern Hispanic art was not deeply self-reflexive. Although it never produced the sheer volume of depictions of artists at work as occurred in, say, the Low Countries during the same period, numerous works of scholarship, from Victor Stoichita's Self-Aware Image to the Prado's exhibition Meta Pintura, curated by Javier Portus, to Benito Navarrete Prieto's work on Murillo, to the monumental literature on Las Meninas, clearly demonstrate that the theorization of art, of the status of the image and the image maker, was of great urgency to artists in the early modern Hispanic world. Returning to my work on the book, the online search engines I was using allowed me to refine my searches for specific keywords, retrato, bulto, pintura, and look at them by date range. And in doing so, I began to notice the types of publications that discussed images. And in following, I'll briefly outline the parameters of my current project through that lens. It was no surprise, of course, to discover that results appeared frequently in what we might term traditional art theoretical literature, or the artistic treatise. And I'm thinking here of texts like Pacheco's Arte de la Pintura, Carducho's Diálogos de la Pintura, and so on. What's more, specific descriptions of specific artworks, artists, and artistic practices appeared with great frequency in, for instance, the lives of saints, such as in the narratives of the visions of St. John of the Cross, with its fascinating account and illustration of the anamorphic distortions of the crucifix that the saint witnessed. And I'll show you an example of that here. Similarly, in a text such as Francisco de Florencia's La Estrella del Norte de Mexico, first published in 1688, abounds in descriptions of the appearance, evaluation, and reception of a specific image, as say the Virgin of Guadalupe. But more surprising to me were the texts that had no clear reason for turning to the description of an artistic process, be it the conceptualization, creation, examination, or usage of images, but nevertheless deployed descriptions of those artistic processes with didactic or explanatory intent, that is to say, aiming to clarify concepts from other fields of knowledge. I'm of course not the first person to notice this. For instance, Fernando Bouza has noticed that political texts commonly made, and I quote, recourse to artistic language, end quote, and that, and I quote again, the vocabulary of art offered its terminology, drawing, pigments, brush, copper sheet, as a frame into which the government of the monarchy could be projected, end quote. Consider, for instance, what is probably the most famous of these, when the Franciscan theologian Juan de Santa Maria listed a number of oppositions to highlight the differences between a king in name only and a king who truly behaves like a king. He asks the reader to imagine a painter, he asks the reader to imagine a king dressed in purple, seated on a throne with great majesty, befitting his grandeur, and grave and severe and terrible in appearance, but nothing in deeds. This is like a painting by the hand of the Greek, El Greco, which when placed on high and seen from afar, appears to be very good and to depict a lot, but from up close is only streaks and smudges. Great majesty and conceit and a good appearance are no more than a sketch and a shadow of a king, end quote. Santa Maria is here addressing a sophisticated reader who may have either traveled and encountered El Greco's works in person or heard of his idiosyncratic style of painting. More generally, he's using a codified artistic simile that associated the painterly style with form, but not substance, or that it was an illusion that quickly evaporated in the moment of desengaño, of the revealing of deceit. A few questions came to mind when encountering example after example of such an easy introduction of artistic examples into non-artistic texts. Was this simply the product of an early modern intellectual interdisciplinarity, which is foreign or noteworthy only to someone accustomed to the contemporary corralling of knowledge into discrete academic disciplines? There's undoubtedly some of this, but the specific contexts in which specifically painting and other forms of art making were examined required, to my mind, further investigation. Some of the questions, therefore, currently guiding my thinking are: when did authors turn to artistic metaphors in their writings? What kinds of non-artistic concepts were best explained through the language of art? What kinds of audiences benefited from them? What kinds of artistic forms and practices were deployed with explanatory intent? And finally, was the metaphorical usage of art making unique? Or was it simply one of many different types of human creativity that were deployed in the service of conveying knowledge? It was, I suspect, the flexible position of artistic creation between the artisanal and the intellectual in the 16th and 17th centuries that granted it a unique status among the fields of human activity. What's more, this status was precisely in this period undergoing a gradual transformation from predominantly the first to more strongly the second, not in a straightforward theological or unidirectional manner, but in one that was flexible, highly dependent on context, on place and time. Thanks to this double nature, which combined mental labor with clear manual components, artistic creation could adapt to the exigencies of explaining a wide range of concepts. With the questions I'm here posing, I should also note, as I mentioned in my brief introductory remarks, that this is a very open-ended project. I first presented a preliminary version of it of all places in Durham Castle in 2019 during a conference organized by Edward Payne and Stefano Cracolici titled Canons and Repertoires, Constructing the Visual Arts in the Hispanic World, in which Claudia appears and many others of you undoubtedly participated. But it's only now that I've had a chance to return and to begin to rethink this project, which is why I'm so grateful for your suggestions about potential directions of research. I should also note here, and this is the last of my housekeeping points, that although such a project would be nearly impossible without search engines such as Google Books, I'm not currently conceiving of this as an intervention in big data or text mining. Indeed, a search for the term pintura, or painting, in books published between 1500 or 1700 would produce infinite results, the majority of which would not actually align with the questions that interest me here. My selection is based on careful quantitative analysis and sets aside texts in which, as I mentioned, the discussion of art and its practices is a goal in itself. And moreover, although the phenomenon is not exclusive to the Hispanic world, for the moment I'm focusing only on texts written originally in Castilian Spanish. Within these parameters, there appears to have been a specific range of situations in which authors found artistic metaphors particularly evocative, or contexts that benefited particularly strongly from explanations borrowed from the realm of visual culture. I will in following introduce two of these that appear to dominate the instances of the metaphorical usage of images that I've thus far identified, even though there were, of course, many others. Lanutha's text that I began with, once again, a homily, can serve as an introduction to the first of these, namely texts that were records of sermons or that served to be read aloud during religious services. In sums, texts that may have been heard in religious spaces, perhaps even more importantly than having been privately read. It's well established that early modern preachers used the images that surrounded them in churches and oratories to enhance the impact of the moralizing narratives they shared. These were additionally strengthened with theatrical maneuvers, sounds, and scents. We can therefore easily imagine Lanutha pointing to a painting on the wall and even imitating the body language of the censorious painter from the text of the homily, who, like God, leans in and then pulls back from the work he has just finished painting and then determines that it was good. Two engravings from Diego Valadez's Retórica Cristiana of 1579 illustrate an imagined scenario of the use of images in predication. In the first, a friar instructs an indigenous American congregation, pointing to a scene from the Passion. Images, the text explains, and I quote, revealed to the congregants the mysteries of our redemption, and in this way they became better affixed in their memories, end quote. In the second engraving, the same protagonists now inhabit the Passion narrative directly and respond with wonder and veneration to while the preacher continues his lesson. The power of rhetoric was enhanced by the image, to which it served as a complement and which it could additionally explain extemporaneously. Valadez's visual argument was that when rhetoric and the visual worked together, audiences came to imaginatively inhabit a shared space with the sacred protagonists. It's not surprising, therefore, that Lanutha should have turned to the experience of an artist at work, considering that his homily, too, was delivered in a space filled with the products of artistic labor. Another author, the Castilian Mercedarian Juan de San Gabriel, in a sermon for the Sunday of Temptation, or the first Sunday of Lent, published in Saragossa in 1656, sets up a complex comparison between painted images and demonic deceit in a description of Behemoth from the Book of Job, which in the original Latin describes the monster as having bones like plates of iron, sicut laminae ferrae, or if you like it in American English, sicut laminae ferrae. They appear like iron in how strong they are and how hard. Note San Gabriel, that he rhetorically questions why the bones should resemble sheets or plates which bend easily. The bones of the demon, he then responds, resemble copper plates on which are painted images and which tend to come from Rome. I'll now read the passage in which San Gabriel imagines an encounter between a capricious client and an obsequious artist. And I quote, "A painter comes to you, and you ask him for a landscape with beautiful fountains, freshness, and water. The painter knows your taste, and he takes great pains to paint you many fountains, much grace, many rivers, much freshness. You ask him to paint among these forests a hermit. He paints one. You beg him to erase the hermit. He erases him. And even though the painting is nothing more than iron at its core, The brush is able to create this entire construction, to paint your inclination. This is the devil's strength. And the iron is the foundation of vice. And he paints you as you are inclined, falsified images of virtue. These pathetic little sheets, laminicas, these pathetic little images, imaginicas, cover the iron of vice. In painting you a scene of gallantry, he's painting you recklessness. He wants that a painting of frivolous conversation be sold as a painting of civility. And finally, he draws all of the virtues in order to hide all of the vices. And selling these fake sheets, he introduces real sins. Juan de San Gabriel sets up an elaborate comparison where the devil is both the painter himself, he paints you falsified images of virtue, and where he is the actual support of the described images. His bones are like sheets of iron. The iron equated with vice is at the core of the painting. And what's more, the paintings themselves deceive by pretending to be one thing, but actually depicting another. It's tempting to imagine San Gabriel or another priest who may have read his book deliver a homily in a space filled with images, perhaps even a space filled with paintings of hermits, as were so common at the time, such as the Anunciada monastery in Villafranca del Bierzo, for which the Marquis of Villafranca commissioned a series of at least 30 scenes of hermits from Flemish painters residing in Rome, or the series of hermit saints painted by Juan de Solis for the Hermitage of the Magdalene in the Buen Retiro. Noteworthy in San Gabriel's homily is his active distrust of the visual, which appears to go beyond the standard discourse of engaño, or the artful deceitfulness of images, which permeated early modern Hispanic writing. In all of his attention to the material structure of images and the stages of their creation, including their reworking, he appears to slide between the approach of Saint Teresa of Avila, who, in Victor Stoichita's words, and I quote, never shrank away from taking advantage of any help that might be forthcoming from paintings and sculptures, end quote, and the position of Saint John the Cross, who, again, in Stoichita's words, epitomizes the aniconic pole of Spanish mysticism, end quote. Felipe Pereda has shown on the example of the 15th and 16th centuries that the church was far from presenting a unified front on the question of images. Moreover, the exceedingly terse recommendations of the Tridentine Council meant that there continued a pattern of highly divergent approaches regarding the benefits of using images in predication, education, and conversion. San Gabriel, for all of his knowledge of iconography and even the networks of artistic creation and circulation, recall that he describes the paintings on metal as originating in Rome, remained, it seems, a skeptic of images. Painting becomes an armature to discuss the concept of deceitfulness with particular frequency, in part because of the lengthy association of the two, including in numerous Christian exegetical texts about ancient idolatry, as well as in famous anecdotes of the ancient Zeuxis or Apelles, referred by Pliny, which in turn were widely discussed in artistic literature by figures like Pacheco, Carducho, or Díaz del Valle. But this also permeates non-artistic writing. For instance, the Toledan prebendary Pedro Sanchez's Historia Moral y Filosófica 1590 describes, and I quote, an excellent painter who through the art of perspective can make an image taken from life appear to be alive. And so too the world deceives us with its artfulness and its cunning. It makes us think that that which is transitory is fixed. And it can also be compared to the drawing of a mappa mundi, which shows us all of the cities and provinces of the world. And you can see it in it, the sea and the earth and the entirety of this inferior world. But it is nothing more than a bit of paper that can be chewed up by a little mouse. As far as I can tell, this is quite an unusual mention of the cartographer's rather than the painter's craft used in such a context. in which its paper support specifically makes it susceptible to the damage that challenges its status as a universal source of knowledge. And I show you, just as a digression, I couldn't resist a map by Ptolemy printed in Rome, which does not actually include Durham, but it does include the river Weir, or Vedra fluvius, you could just see. There was arguably nothing more illusionistic in Europe and its colonies in the 16th and 17th centuries than painting. I show you here a favorite trompe-l'oeil from the Prado. It's characterized by a permanent tension between enlivened image and dead matter, between an impression of truth and entirely manufactured reality. Behind the experience of its viewing is the recurrent frisson and of realizing that the person or animal or place or objects that one is contemplating is actually nothing more than an accumulation of rude materials, of layers of plaster, charcoal, pigments suspended in oil, and varnish on a woven or planed or polished surface. It was these aspects, these realizations, that made painting so effective a metaphor for deceit, for mere appearance of stability. The connection between painting in all its creative aspects and its capacity to lie continues to be in vogue in non-artistic writing and is often deployed as the quintessential example of mundanity and vanity, as the principal sin of artistic creation, which was likely much to the chagrin of individuals invested in raising the status of painting. Certain concepts appear to have been explained through recourse to pictorial metaphors with particular frequency. Some of these include invention or ideation, imitation or substitution, reproduction and genealogy, often explained through the language of portraiture, and, as I just discussed, deceit and, by extension, vanitas. These same concepts dominated artistic debates in Europe and the colonial world between the 16th and 18th centuries. And it may be that arts were particularly suited to broader considerations on these topics, or that a wide range of readers may have read precisely of these topics in art theoretical literature and then later adapted them to their own explanatory needs. Another notable focus in the metaphorical usage of artistic concepts is the topos of Deus Pictor or Deus Artifex, God as the supreme artificer, itself commonly, frequently even represented in paintings from across the Hispanic world. I show you here a mid-18th century example from New Spain. Lanuza's example of the painter inspecting his work serves as a way to approximate the work by which God embarked on crafting the laws of the universe. And such uses, which highlighted painting's nobility, undoubtedly contributed to the gradual elevation of its social status. In a different book from the same Pedro Sanchez, who discussed the Mappa Mundi, we read that from the ideas that are in the divine mind, which are invisible forms, proceed the visible forms of the creations that we see in the world. This is like, in its way, the works that an artist makes, which proceed from the model or design that he has in his intellect, such as the house that the architect wants to build, or the drawing made by a painter. The drawings and engraving of the final painting for an ephemeral arch that I show you here, attributed to Matias de Torres, demonstrate the stages of the intellectual process as described by Sanchez. If the ideation of a work of art by an artist was equivalent to the process of divine creation, and keep in mind that Sanchez is writing in 1595, decades before El Greco's famous challenge to the Alcabala tax, this was a powerful, if ultimately quite conventional because so often repeated, statement on what it was that painters did. However, it's necessary to acknowledge that other professions that are also associated with God, in addition to the divine painter, are similarly used in a metaphorical, explanatory manner. For instance, the topos of God as fisherman of souls, which relates to a number of standard iconographies, including of the miraculous catch of fishes or Christ at the Sea of Galilee. The royal chaplain, Cristobal Lozano, for instance, rhetorically inquired of his readers, "Have you seen, O faithful, the careful fisherman who on the banks of the river throws the line into the water, puts bait on the hook? Well, in the same way, God is a fisher of souls, who in order to lead man out of the sea of his misery, casts the hook of assistance." However, these other professions do not appear to have aroused such a widespread literary interest, perhaps because they carried less associative complexity than did painting, whose practitioners were actively involved in a status struggle and in a theorization of their own discipline. What emerges as a particularly interesting feature to me of many of the texts that discuss artistic production is the attention that is granted to the numerous phases or steps that went into the creation of an artwork, because they suggest a widespread readership of publications on art making. This attention acknowledges the complexity of artistic creation and its processes, the numerous hands it required, as well as a specialized knowledge of its terminology and tools. This is exemplified in a passage from the orator and theologian Laureano del Cárcamo, who in his Asuntos Predicables of 1637 deployed the metaphor of a painter king in order to explain the composite nature of St. John the Baptist. Let us suppose, Cárcamo writes, that a king practices the art of painting, and that one day he wanted to paint a St. John in order to present the painting to the queen. With this, we should understand that the king withdrew to his palace and that he placed before himself all of his drawings and examples and prints, and from them he selected images of St. Jerome, St. Leander, a pope, and an emperor. He did this not because his St. John was to be made absolutely in imitation of any of these prints, but rather to select from each one its best element. From one, the beauty of a forehead, from another, the perfection of its eyes, from a third, the grace of its lips, and thus it can be said that, once finished, in St. John are all the saints. The passage is clearly a modernization or a Christianization even of the classical account narrated by both Cicero and Pliny of Zeuxis, who created an image of Helen of Troy by recomposing the best features of 5 young women from the city of Croton. What's more, it thematizes the early modern understanding of originality and influence in artistic creation on the example of the citation of printed materials. A recurrent historiography in the last decades showed, for instance, that much of the painting produced in Spain's American viceroyalties for the voracious needs of the Catholic Church was indebted to printed European models, largely from Flanders. This model implicitly established a hierarchy between the generative creativity of Europe and the supposed passive reception and replication that characterized artistic production in the colonial Americas. In recent years, this question has received increased interest and has been subjected to reevaluation from 2 perspectives. The first of which recognizes the creative potential of citation, including recent work by Aaron Hyman, and the second, which has thoughtfully examined the use of pictorial citation prints, widespread practice in European early modern painting. And I'm thinking here of Benito Navarrete Prieto's work again on the Spanish context. Cárcamo's passage valorizes and naturalizes the practice, which instead of becoming a manifestation of lessened creativity, shows citation in painting as a practice that challenged the visual intelligence of its publics and was almost an invitation to a game of identifying references between works of different formats and media. And you may have seen that I began with a nod to the Zurbarán Centre with the series of Zurbarán's Joseph and his 12 Sons from Bishop Auckland. This is a series, of course, that has been carefully studied for the printed sources that Zurbarán himself may have turned to, probably most explicitly Durer's Noli Me Tangere for his figure of Naphtali, but also I've suggested that for his figures, his turbaned figures, including Reuben, he may have looked at Melchior Lorck's representations of various figures from Constantinople, which bear certain, to me, quite striking similarities. And this one works better if flipped around. And of course, indeed, the Bolognese writer Cesare Malvasia posed the rhetorical question, what painter in some way does not steal, either from prints or reliefs or nature or works by others, reversing postures, twisting an arm lower, displaying a leg, changing a face, adding a drapery, in some judiciously hiding the theft, end quote. Domenichino's variations on the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden illustrates Malvasia's point well. Like the other texts I've considered, Cárcamo's passage would have, however, implicitly participated in the fight for status by demonstrating that painters relied on the same mechanisms that God himself had used when designing his saints. An important question regards the participants in this network of readers and writers who thought about artistic concepts. Who were these metaphors for? Who was equipped to understand them? The Augustinian theologian Cristobal de Fonseca noted, and I quote, that everyone who lives in the house of a painter knows something of art, at least what a paintbrush is, how to paint in oil and tempera, and how to make at least a sketch, end quote. But the proliferation of artistic references in early modern literature suggests strongly that the readers of these texts understood and could benefit from the intellectual exercise of thinking about art making, even if they were not painters or their family members themselves. Indeed, Fonseca himself implicitly assumes that all of his readers, painters or not, will understand that there was a difference between oil and tempera and that sketching occurred at the beginning of the artistic process. This is not surprising. Readers across the Hispanic world, from Madrid to Mexico City to Manila, lived in a world saturated with images. Every day they looked at, prayed to, bought, sold, reused, even destroyed art objects broadly construed. Patrizia Cavazzini has shown that in Seicento Rome, artworks were accessible to individuals from nearly every social rank. And Miguel Falomir has demonstrated that the situation was similar in early 17th century Spain. An image like Jose Antolinus's ironic description of a ironic depiction, not iconic description, of a painter selling his works in a shabby atelier and a handful of coins on the table, perhaps the humble result of his latest transaction, corroborates this idea. Even though some of the references to artistic practices appear in sermons and homilies, thereby suggesting a wider audience than might be expected of texts that were not read aloud, this does not mean that sermons were uniformly popular in intent. Indeed, in another homily, our friend, the ecclesiastic Lanuza, explicates the term hora suya, or his hour, in reference to the hour of Christ's death. He notes, we say hora suya in the way that schools and universities, each professor calls it his own hour when he comes into the classroom to teach. The reference to university professors suggests a public that understood both an academic vocabulary and the structure of those educational institutions. However, immediately after, Lanuza refers to the structure of an entirely different institution, the workshop of a painter. I show you here one of my favorite 17th century self-portraits attributed to Pedro de Moya, where you can just see that he's begun sketching out on the canvas behind him what appears to be a Immaculate Conception. Lanuza writes, we also say his hour or su hora in the manner that refers to a painter, in that first his apprentices prepare the canvas, they sketch on it, drawing lines and scratches, and they proceed to marking out shapes. Once this is done, the painter undertakes the work of giving an appearance to the painting, applying by his hand lively colors, retouching everything that his apprentices drew out. From the beginning of the world, the apprentices of our Lord had begun to paint our redemption, making the first sketches and lines, painting innumerable figures, and making various drawings. Now the great painter has to give the lively colors and spirit to the painting. The sheer quantity of painterly concepts and terms suggests that Lanuza's description derives from the artistic discourse of the period. A slightly later description, and perhaps someone knows of an earlier one that would fit well here, found in Carducho's Diálogos de la Pintura of 1633, notes, and I quote, that the expert painter makes the first marks, and then, once the apprentice finishes his work, the master returns to retouch and perfect it, which is the last stage and the delicate touch that gives it its soul and in which one can recognize its mastery. There are crucial differences between the two passages. For Lanuza, it is the apprentice and not the master who sketches out the initial profiles. This was arguably the only option in Lanuza's metaphor, given that Christ, the master painter, only arrived to the world after millennia of implicit preparations. Carducho, on the other hand, deeply invested in highlighting artistic ingenium and invention, would have likely never ceded this crucial stage of the artistic process to a nameless workshop assistant. For all of Lanuza's reading of sources on artistic processes, he ultimately adapted them to parameters of his particular project. After all, he himself was not a painter and was unlikely to have been concerned with the project of elevating the intellectual status of painters, which mattered to someone like Carducho. I conclude with a jump forward in time and to the only part of the talk that may still be familiar to Piers and Claudia from when I first embarked upon this project. This is a consideration of the 1826 edition of James Elmas's A General and Bibliographical Dictionary of the Fine Arts, which includes a veritable bibliographical litany of books on painting. These are divided by nationality or language and organized into sections, such as books on principal lexicons and dictionaries on painting, works which treat in general of the lives of painters of every age or country, or on the history of painting in general. Across the two largest categories of his dictionary, these are the theory and practice of art of painting, and on various subjects connected with the art of painting, or the praise of arts in general, 53 of the bibliographical positions that he lists are in Italian, 40 are in French, 34 each are in English and German, and 17 are in Latin. In Spanish, there are a mere 8 positions, with a smaller number, 3, only in Dutch. Among the Spanish texts, we encounter all the usual suspects. Pacheco's Arte de la Pintura, published posthumously in 1649, sits among well-known treatises by Palomino, Carducho, Juan de Butron, and Juan de Jauregui. The list is rounded out by 17th century Portuguese writer Felipe Núñez and the late 18th century poet Diego Antón Regón de Silva. Even though Elmas's list ignores certain important positions, the treatises of Arfe de Villafañe, the Discursos of Giuseppe Martinez, and later the writings of Juan Bermúdez, there are undoubtedly fewer Spanish artistic treatises than Italian or French ones. That's indisputable. In present-day scholarship of the early modern period, we might see less of a clear distinction between such national schools, And we can point to the outsized importance granted to Spain in the history of the Italian Renaissance, in the work of scholars like Thomas Dandelay, Piers Baker Bates, who's here with us, and Elena Calvillo, or in the recent exhibition at the Uffizi on the dialogue between Spain and Italy in the Cinquecento. But though outdated, 19th century texts like Elmas's Dictionary and later work of a scholar like Anthony Blunt on Italian artistic treatises still contribute to conveying a sense that in Spanish, artistic theory was much less frequently debated and discussed, and certainly less frequently published than in other European tongues. Spain does appear in Blunt's examination of Italian artistic literature, but only near the end, in his chapter, The Council of Trent and Religious Art. There, it's given a deeply unflattering assessment, defined, and I quote, as socially and politically behind the time, end quote, but also the most powerful ally for the papacy, which in turning to Spain for support, and I quote, moved from a leading place among the progressive states of Italy to one of reaction, end quote. Spain, in Blunt's telling, can be directly correlated to the dismantling of the intellectual, rational achievements of the Italian Renaissance. The movement, and I quote again from Blunt, was just as much a counter-Renaissance as a counter-Reformation, and it set itself to destroy the human scale of values in which the humanists believed, and to replace it once again with a theological scale, such as had been maintained during the Middle Ages, end quote. Blunt's Burckhartian assessment of the theory of the Renaissance argued that it was a reflection of a broader set of new preoccupations with naturalism, quote, based on the scientific study of the outside world by means of the new weapons of perspective and anatomy, end quote, and the forms of classical antiquity, which were marshaled to answer what he called the demands of human reason rather than the mystical needs of medieval Catholicism. Basically, he saw the painter who was a craftsman who worked a practical function in need of the church. As such, any writing about art in relation to religion could not achieve the humanistic sophistication of the supposedly secular writings of the high Italian Renaissance. But in the Hispanic world, and I switch here again to my conversing gentleman, an Englishman and a Spaniard, but both residing currently in Dallas, art, its categories and functions, its modes of making and modes of viewing, was in fact widely debated and widely published upon. The places where these debates occurred were not, however, always in the self-consciously defined artistic treatise, but in religious sermons, in synodal proceedings, in texts of political theory or religious doctrine. Juan Luis González García has shown that Spain was, and I quote, in the European vanguard, end quote, in the production of such texts, which often do not explicitly announce their investment or interest in image theory, but are nevertheless crucial to understanding period debates about art's roles, boundaries, and publics. González García has noted, and I quote, that the frequent allusions to painters, paintings, and pictorial concepts in Golden Age preaching have and almost never been examined by art historians, regardless of the formidable possibilities that they present for the study of the creation, reception, and interpretation of the arts of the period, end quote. Indeed, the careful definition of an art object is frequently an essential element of such arrangements. Painting, as I mentioned, was in a process of transformation in the period we've been examining, both in Spain and its viceroyalties, put most reductively from craft to liberal art. It served as a flexible point of reference, standing in easily for a wide range of intellectual concepts. When authors drew on the vocabulary of painting and the other visual arts, they not only metaphorized these for their own non-artistic purposes, they also actively contributed to debates on images. Going beyond what art theoretical texts, which are often both proscriptive and prescriptive, can tell us, these other wider range of texts reveals a facet of how early modern individuals thought about and used artworks. And they contribute, I think, to a richer picture of the history of thinking about images in the early modern Hispanic world. Thanks very much.